Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the CUHK University of Sydney SDG webinar on sustainability challenges today. We will begin with a welcome remark from Ms. Shirley Fan, Director of Academic Links at CUHK. Shirley, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants who are joining today's the Chinese University of Hong Kong, University of Sydney SDG webinar series on partnering for sustainability challenges, climate, oceans, cities, and communities. My name is Shirley Fan, and I am the Director of Academic Links at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Together with Amanda Cyan, the University of Sydney's Director of Partnerships, we'll be hosting the webinar today. Our colleagues Xiaohui and Yvonne will be helping to ensure our smooth operation today. Today is the first of a series of SDG-themed webinars the two universities will be hosting to encourage dialogue and collaboration in sustainable development. We will start with a showcase on two of our research projects between CUHK and Sydney. Our first speakers are Professor Kevin Lau from CUHK's Institute of Future Cities and Dr. Lee Wilson from Sydney's Faculty of Medicine and Health. They've been awarded funding to carry out their project on the impact on the built environments on heat-related mobility and mortality in two highly urbanized cities, Sydney and Hong Kong. Our second team of speakers are Professor Laura Falkenberg from CUHK's School of Life Sciences and Professor Pauline Ross from Sydney's School of Life and Environmental Sciences and Professor Elliot Scan from the University of Technology, Sydney. They have received funding to carry out a marine ecosystem research project to investigate the potential of seagrass to counter the effects of elevated carbon dioxide and to protect oysters from acidifying seawater. This will be followed by a Q&A session, which my colleague Amanda will moderate. We will then place everybody into one of two networking rooms for about 20 minutes. And this is going to be very informal, and we encourage everybody to stay with this because this is where the magic is supposed to happen. After this, we'll bring everybody back to give you a brief presentation on funding opportunities. Before we start, can I remind everybody to keep their microphone muted during the presentations and to keep your video on for better engagement. You can raise questions throughout the presentation using the chat box, or you can do so during the Q&A session. Thank you. Yvonne.
Thank you, Shirley. We now have the pleasure to introduce our first pair of speakers, Professor Kevin Lau and Dr. Lee Wilson, to present a project on urbanization and the implications for health in Sydney and Hong Kong. I'll just share the screen. Sorry, one moment, please. Okay, Professor Lau and Dr. Wilson, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity of presenting to you today. Kevin and I are going to present this together, and our project has been going for quite a while now. It has been impacted by COVID-19, of course. So, Yvonne, could you go back to our title slide, please?
Sorry.
So, I've put these two pictures here. Oh, sorry, done again.
The last slide? Sorry.
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry.
Just so that you can get a bit of an idea and a picture in your mind of what it looks like at night in both Sydney and Hong Kong. Next slide, thank you. And urbanisation and extreme temperatures are increasing both in Australia, but particularly in Sydney and Hong Kong as well. Most people think Australia is actually a very big, vast, open country. But in Sydney particularly, high-rise development is increasing at a really rapid rate. And along with that, we're also getting an increase in the rate of extreme heat wave events. And you can see here in a couple of these images, the lower image is Hong Kong and you can see Sydney sweltering in 40 and above heatwave days. Thank you, Yvonne. So the aim of our project was to develop a better understanding of the combined effect of extreme heat and urbanisation on mortality in both Sydney and Hong Kong. And we wanted to incorporate urban characteristics into a statistical analysis to identify the spatial pattern of heat health risk in both cities. You can see here, this is a heat health map of one of our local councils in the middle of Sydney. You can see the different temperatures based on the type of dwelling and the location and the proximity to the bay, which is around the edges of this particular locality. Thanks, Yvonne. So with the Australian data, we know that Australian temperatures are increasing exponentially. And the starkest feature of our last summer was the record temperatures. The national average was expected to be about 2.1 above average, but it easily beat the previous record, which was set in the summer of 2012-13. We did have very low rainfall accompanying the record heat, and at a national scale, each month was notably dry. And of course, you will probably be aware we've also had, in the last just over 18 months, extremely bad bushfires as a result of our extreme heat. July 2021, just gone, is the hottest July on record in the world. Thanks, Yvonne.
Well, and similar in Hong Kong, we also experience increasing frequency, intensity, and also the duration of extreme hot weather. So you can see here in our in the slides that the number of hot days, very hot days and hot nights, which are two indicators we used in Hong Kong to represent daytime and also nighttime extreme hot weather. And you can see the number of both hot days and hot nights are increasing in the last 20 to 30 years, and especially in the last 10 years, we have been breaking all the records of the number of very hot days, the duration of such extreme hot weather in Hong Kong. And you can see on the top right-hand corner is the projection by the Hong Kong Observatory that the number of hot nights, the yellow bar here, would increase to about 150 days at the end of this century. So as you can imagine that we are having extreme hot weather for not just the summer, but also an extended summer period. Next, please. Yes.
So we went to think about the uniqueness and the achievements of our collaboration. We've both had the opportunity to identify similarities and differences between Hong Kong and Sydney, but also in our population and the way it's distributed. We've also been able to map our communities and their heatwave vulnerability. This is another heatwave map that's been developed for another part of Sydney, looking at, again, the distribution of housing, type of housing and the density. Here in Sydney, we've identified other local partners that can help us with this. So, for example, organisations that map green space, but also organisations such as local councils that have taken up, well, many of them have taken up the initiative to actually heatwave map their local vicinity. Next, please. Thanks, Yvonne.
Right, and through our collaborations, our research work here, we found that, especially in Hong Kong, that the heat-related risk and also vulnerability is quite different for daytime and nighttime. So you can see on the left-hand side here, the heat risk is actually higher in the rural area because of the more exposed environment. But on the right-hand side, you can see it during nighttime that the heat risk actually concentrated in the downtown area, in the dense urban area, which causes quite a lot of health-related problems in our city. Next, please.
So in terms of resources, in Sydney, one of our difficulties and our challenges was that access to mortality data is actually very expensive. And it's also quite difficult to get where the data is collected in small cell areas. So where in fact there might be less than an optimal number, of course, it rounds down to 0. So it was very difficult for us to actually map our mortality to our heat wave vulnerability. That's something we need to focus on for the future in terms of looking for funding to do that in a little bit more thorough and rigorous way.
But luckily in Hong Kong, we are easier to get the mortality data, and it's also at a finer spatial scale. But when we try to look at the some other health data, for example, the hospitalization, the A&E data, that we found that the spatial resolution or the spatial distribution is actually quite confined to the 18th district, which is large districts, and they are not that homogeneous in terms of the urban environment. So it kind of like this difficult to generalize the urbanization effect on the heat health relationship. Next, please. And
so
then,
in terms of, sorry, you go, Kevin.
Yeah, I'll start the first point. And then we found that like in our work here, we found that the spatial understanding is very important, especially in terms of like developing community level adaptation strategies, because we need to know the specific conditions of the urban environment so that the local stakeholders like the NGOs, the district councils, and also the individual even can react or to take response action correspondingly. Lee, please.
And so for us in Sydney, while we could map out vulnerability, as I said, it was actually really difficult with a small grant to access the data, to do the analysis at the spatial level that we were interested in doing, because we wanted to compare that sort of spatial granularity with Hong Kong. But having said that, our research support has been excellent. It's really hoped that we continue to work with the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We've had amazing support from Xiaohui here and Amanda here in Sydney. And I'm sure Kevin would say the same about the research support in Hong Kong as well. Thanks, Yvonne. Next one. So our keys to success and our challenges, well, we had our first workshop, didn't we, Kevin? You got to come to Sydney, which was wonderful. But unfortunately, due to the unrest in Hong Kong, in December, the year we were supposed to come, and then of course the impact of COVID has made our inter-country travel really difficult. And part of our grant was to actually have stakeholder meetings where we could have a lot of input from interested personnel and local NGOs and councils so that we could feed back the data to them that we had actually found and work with them in terms of implementing this. But of course, the requirements that we had to put into place in terms of our academic work, but also other things that COVID has impacted on, have made it quite challenging over the last 18 months. Yes, please, Yvonne. Thank you. So it has impacted on our ability to hold workshops. Moving forward, we'd really like to continue to collaborate and engage other partners. And at Sydney, we'll be seeking funding to continue our project to do our mortality mapping.
And similar in Hong Kong, we also, based on kind of like extension or apart from this project, we also get another project funded by the Research Impact Fund on developing the adaptation and mitigation strategies for elderly people in response to the extreme hot weather, especially for the future climate change in Hong Kong. Right. Thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you. And just to give a little bit of advice for our early career researchers, I think one of the things that's really important to do, and I've learned so much by being involved with the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I think it's really important to think about seeking funding and foster those collegial collaborations between organisations. For me, it's about having project ideas ready and written up so that when there are funding calls, you have something there that you can target your research towards, and to just join as many international networks and partnerships as you can, because you get so much knowledge and learning from the different lenses between different disciplines. So for example, I come from health science. Kevin is sitting in the Institute of Future Cities. I have partners that I collaborate with in the School of Architecture at CUHK, for example. And so those different backgrounds and different disciplines, it's wonderful to work together. So I encourage all you early career researchers to do that and think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lau and Dr. Wilson. Next, may I introduce Professor Pauline Ross, Professor Lauren Falkenberg, and Dr. Alice Gens to talk about the project on oyster aquaculture. Professor Ross, I'll share your slides now and you may begin when you're ready.
So can everyone hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it's so nice to be here. I want to thank you for inviting myself and Laura and Elliot to present on our work, which is on partnerships really and sustainability in a time of change for marine ecosystems. If you could pass to the next slide, please. So we might all be aware of the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their 6th report. And they indicated to us two things in that report, that the first being unequivocal. If you could just continue on to the next, press down, I think. The first one, that it was unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. And certainly in the previous presentation, you know, there was a clear sign of that warming I could see around Sydney, in New South Wales and Hong Kong. If you could press to the next. And also, not only will it be warming, but as you can see in yellow in the section B.5.1 from the summary of the climate change report, ocean acidification is virtually certain. And if you can go to the next slide, please. This slide is a picture of what we're sort of facing in the future, or facing from, you know, 2100 in terms of the pH level of our oceans. If you take the SSP pathway, which is the shared socio-economic pathway of the mildest form in the blue line, the SSP 1-19, you can see that pH of our oceans will only drop by about 0.1. So it'll go from about 8.1 to 8.0. The worst case scenario, which is SSP 5-8.5 at the end of this century, means that our pH will drop from 8.1 to 7.6 or 7.65 in our oceans. Now that doesn't seem very much, does it? But for marine organisms living in our oceans, particularly shellfish and oysters, it's going to be energetically more costly for them to exist, because they're going to have to cope with more acidic blood, and they're going to have to be able to pump out that, or equilibrate their acidic blood and pump out some of that hydrogen ions so that they can actually function and their metabolic processes can function. Now, it's been estimated that it's about 100 billion USD will be the loss of shellfish aquaculture if we continue on the moderate socioeconomic pathway. If you could go to the next slide, please. If you look at what this means for both Australia and Asia, since about the 1870s, you know, we've been very focused on the oyster as our main aquaculture species, and so they're valued at about 40 million a year, and that would be pretty much our loss at about a pH of 7.8, from 8.1 to 7.8. And Asia, they produce 92% of the world's oysters, of which much of that comes from Hong Kong and China. And annually, this is estimated at $7.31 billion of loss if we are to proceed on that, you know, sort of worst case shared socioeconomic pathway. So there's been lots of talk recently about how can we ameliorate or how can we make our shellfish more resilient to predicted changes in our climate. If you could go to the next slide, please. Can other habitats such as seagrass be a refuge for marine organisms and oysters? and ameliorate the conditions that we expect from climate change. And this is because seagrasses can actually produce and absorb CO2, and they can absorb CO2, and if they can absorb CO2, then they're going to ameliorate that drastic decline in pH, which we're expecting. So both the University of Sydney and the Chinese University in Hong Kong, if we could go to the next slide, came together with an aim to see whether this is going to be a possible solution to climate change. And we did this in two main ways. The first way, we led by the Chinese University in Hong Kong and Laura Falkenberg, was to do a systematic review of literature to understand previous efforts to counter acidification using photosynthesizers. Laura will tell you about some of the news we've had this morning on that particular aim. And at Sydney University here, we decided to set up an experiment to test the prediction that seagrass would be beneficial for oysters when they're grown with seagrasses, particularly at elevated OA. Elliot's going to share with you now a snapshot of our results. So over to you, Elliot.
Thanks, Pauline. And next slide, please, Yvonne. Great. So for the experimental aspect of this work, we predicted that oysters cultured with seagrass will experience greater growth compared to oysters cultured without seagrass under these elevated CO2 conditions that we are talking about for the future under climate change. So we used a mesocosm setup at the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, which on the previous slide there was a photo of, with seawater that had been bubbled with CO2 to represent future ocean conditions of about 750 parts per million CO2, which is along the lines of the moderate emission scenario that we were talking about earlier, that SSP 2 to 2.5, which is quite a likely scenario. And that would represent about 2 to 3 degrees of warming on the planet. So this seawater that had been acidified then flowed into large tanks, which were about 50 litres. And then in these tanks, there were combinations of seagrass, oysters, and also oysters housed alongside seagrass. And this was allowing us to test the effects of CO2 on oysters or seagrass alone and together. We then also did this under ambient CO2, as you can see in the diagram here, which is just normal seawater, just so that we could determine what the effects of CO2 were. And in our oysters, we measured their growth, their metabolic rates, their pH of their blood, and the microbiome, so the bacterial communities associated with both the oysters and the seagrass. Next slide, please. So the first thing we needed to figure out was, does seagrass actually have the capacity to alter the pH of the water before we could figure out whether or not that had any effects on the oysters? So this graph shows the pH of the seawater in our experiment and pH on the vertical axis and time along the bottom axis. And the grey areas of the graph are at night and the yellow are at day. So we can see that during the day, tanks with seagrass, which is the green line, experience an increase in the pH of seawater. And this is strongest at ambient CO2, which is the panel on the left-hand side. However, this pattern is not as strong at elevated CO2. While we can see that there is an increase in pH, it's not as distinct from the tanks without seagrass. Next slide, please. One of the major effects of elevated CO2 and ocean acidification is that the blood of oysters and other organisms can become more acidic, as Pauline mentioned. So this graph shows the pH of our oyster's blood with pH on the vertical axis. And we found that at ambient CO2, so normal seawater conditions, the blood of oysters was less acidic when those oysters were with seagrass. So this is that light green bar on the left-hand side. Again, however, this pattern was not as strong at elevated CO2. And if you compare the two bars on the right-hand side, there really isn't an effect of the presence of seagrass. Next slide, please. This graph is a two-dimensional representation of the bacterial communities on our seagrass. So this is our microbiome results. And we can see that the blue triangles in the bottom left-hand corner is our seagrass when there are no oysters in the tank and they're just in normal seawater ambient CO2 conditions. So the addition of both CO2 and oysters shifts the microbiome of the seagrass, and this may indicate an unhealthy state of the seagrass. So perhaps by adding CO2, we're causing an increase in seagrass disease represented by a change in their bacterial communities. Next slide, please. And this graph is again the microbiome, but this time we're looking at the oyster's gills rather than the seagrass. And we can see that the oysters were actually less affected in terms of their microbiome, and there was no significant effect of CO2, but we did see an effect on the presence of seagrass. So the shapes on the left-hand side, the purple and the blue, are oysters with seagrass at ambient and elevated CO2, and the two shapes on the right-hand side are oysters without seagrass at elevated and ambient CO2. So really the driver of the microbiome was the presence of the seagrass rather than our CO2 treatments. And next slide, please, and I'll hand over to our colleague, Laura.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. So I'm going to finish the presentation with talking about some of our successes, our challenges, and also next steps and how we're moving forward. So firstly, focusing on the achievements of the collaboration. Obviously, the experimental work that Elliot and Pauline have run through this morning has been a big achievement, and that's the basis of a paper that's currently in prep. And also having another paper that was in review when we submitted the slides, but has now just this morning been accepted, looking at this topic. And one of the associated things is in both of those papers will have student co-authors on them, so contributing to the training of students in both Hong Kong and Sydney. Sorry, if you could, next point. Thank you. So the keys to our success, we believe, were having these clear goals, those two clear goals that Pauline, began the talk with, and also linking those with the capabilities, facilities, and also ecosystems of the different researchers and also the different locations. So we made the most of having researchers with access to those facilities at SIM to be able to do the mesocosm and the manipulations there. Next slide. In terms of uniqueness and challenges, so one of the positive unique factors of this work was our opportunity to bring together researchers with distinct areas of expertise. And also we did this while determining our clear roles in contributing to the project. A slight negative was attempting to do this during the COVID-19 pandemic. So our collaboration began just as COVID-19 was emerging as a threat. Next point, please. So if you could move forward. Yep, and again, and one more. Thank you. So challenges that we had to overcome during the collaboration was obviously that COVID-19. We were able to stay with our original goals, but we did need to be flexible in how they would be met. So obviously initially we had people moving around, actually being able to do the experimental work in person, meeting in person to discuss key issues that would be included in the review. But we needed to come up with ways to be able to do that without the travel. Next point. And then, so those are some of the ways that COVID has impacted the collaboration, and our plan forward is to continue developing projects that can be completed independently. So we recognise that for many places, COVID isn't yet over, as colleagues in Sydney know all too well. But also being optimistic and developing projects that will require in-person collaboration for when that's possible again. Next slide. And then more broadly, any advice for building international collaborations, particularly for early career researchers in the audience. So one of my key pieces of advice would be to talk to your peers and develop links within your cohort. So Elliot and I first started talking probably when we were PhD students, and it's however many years later that we've actually been able to get this opportunity to work together. So you kind of never know where links will develop. Also related to that in a way is thinking about projects with people that you think you would work well with, and also make the most of your different areas of expertise. And then finally, particularly for ECRs, looking for funding schemes that are targeted to either building collaborations or supporting ECRs, as they're likely the schemes that you have a track record that would support most strongly. And then the next slide. And then what we're going to do next and how we think collaboration can be sustained. So one of the key ideas, obviously, is having the ideas to sustain collaborations. And we have many of these. A priority of these is highlighted in red here, looking at warming and how this will influence acidification. So as we saw in the IPCC report that came out earlier this week, we see these changes occurring. And so looking at how they will interact and also how they'll have impact both in Hong Kong and also Sydney. We would also, and our projects would also benefit from the capacity to travel and potentially to be able to undertake training and ensure that methods, if we're going to do experimental work, are consistent across places. And all of this, whether it's in person or online collaboration, will require additional funding. And with that, if you could move me to my final slide, I would like to thank you all and also thank the funders of this project, particularly University of Sydney and Chinese University of Hong Kong Partnership Collaboration Awards for supporting this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ross, Professor Hockenberg, and Dr. Scans. May I now hand it to Amanda from the University of Sydney to host our question and answers session. Dear participants, you're welcome to ask questions in person or via the chat box. There will be also plenty of opportunity to follow up with the speakers and your peers during the networking meetings later. Amanda, please.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. And I also would like to thank you, thank all the speakers. We really appreciate your time. Before I start, I just want to really quickly acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm on Camaragal land today. So what I suppose I'd like to start by saying that how important it is projects addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's pretty clear that universities really need to take a leadership role in addressing these sort of wicked challenges such as global warming and climate change. So I don't have any questions in the chat function. So I really encourage, because it's actually a small number of participants, feel free to raise your hand and ask any of the presenters any questions. But thank you also for the advice that you provided at the end of your PowerPoints. Really the purpose of this session is to try and provide some really helpful advice to our early and mid-career researchers. And I suppose I might start and ask Pauline a question off the bat. Pauline, what would your advice be to our early career researchers? What steps do you think they should take if they really want to develop an international collaborative project?
It may be rather obvious given that the question is about collaboration, but I think collaboration is key. And it's key to connect with those people who you believe you're going to work with well. I think the best outcomes arise when you connect and collaborate with people that you get on well with and that you can work well with. I know that sometimes that's not easy to see, in a future way. It's often in hindsight that you think, oh, I really worked well with that person. I got a lot out of it. I learned a lot. I created outcomes. But I think that still remains my advice, everyone, and Amanda, is that if you can somehow determine who you're going to work well with, then that's the first priority. And the second thing I think is really important is to decide up front what those goals are. Like in this day, we need to make sure that we're communicating our goals. So all along the way, we've made sure that we know what we're going to communicate and have set up our future publications. And so that once you've seen our publications have early career researchers on them, and I've always been generous with including as many people as possible onto publications, because this is the way that we all get better together, because it's about uplifting everyone. in a research collaboration. We're all better because of our individual contributions. How about that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you, Pauline. And I suppose it's really important when you think about professors to, provide that mentoring to our early and mid-career researchers, and hence what Pauline was saying about bringing others up and including them on your project. So really encouraging multidisciplinary projects that include like a team of researchers. So sort of maybe trying to move away from that CI to CI and sort of including teams and including the early mid-career researchers. Laura, I have a question for you. I'm just going to throw it out there. So how important is the seed funding to get your collaboration off the ground? And what would you do if you didn't have the seed funding? I suppose, how would you navigate that?
Yeah, so the seed funding is obviously critical in order to be able to show that you can work together, that you can run a project, also manage a budget across institutions as well, and that you can have outcomes to be then able to use that to support longer term, larger projects. Without seed funding, I suppose it would potentially influence the type of project you do. Maybe you try and do a project that's less resource intensive. So for example, in our collaboration, the literature review component didn't really need a lot of funding support. And so maybe you could attempt to do something like that. From my own personal point of view, at the moment, I have a few other sources of funding that aren't specified for particular projects. So if I thought it was a collaboration worth pursuing, could potentially use some of that. But really the seed funding that we've been given has been key to being able to do and achieve what we have.
Thanks very much, Laura, and I agree. And it's great that the seed funding that that Sydney and CUHK have been able to provide. And my hat's off to you being able to complete projects without the face-to-face travel, because we all know that the whole world's pivoted to virtual everything. And this is just seems to be the norm, even though the rest of the world seems to be moving about. We're not, as you pointed out. So yeah, that's a bit more of an added challenge for us. I do have a question for any of the presenters today about networking. So what advice would you give an early career researcher around how to develop those sort of networks, to, which I suppose is really the key to success? Would anyone like to take a stab at answering that? Kevin, awesome, thanks.
Yeah, I think like as an early career researchers, I think it would be good, just as Pauline mentioned, that it's good to talk to people, because when I first met Lee, we talked about like some mutual interest, and then we started with this seed funding, and then later on we actually formed another a consortium of researchers that work on the effect of the urban form on the health of the citizens. And then kind of like expanding from our seed project into a larger, more interdisciplinary consortium, which actually give us quite a lot of like opportunities to extend our research field into a more interdisciplinary areas. So I think it would be, just as Pauline said, that it would be good to start to talk to people, and then to explore the mutual interest, especially if you've got a large research team.
Thanks very much. Laura, please.
I just wanted to sort of, especially while we're in pandemic times, for early career researchers who are coming through now, I mean, a lot of value does come from being able to meet in person, and that's great, but they're not able to do that at the moment. And so I would encourage everyone to set up social media. Particularly here at CUHK, it's not as much a thing as it has been in other places I've worked. But if you start to build a network, start to link in, just start following people whose research you're interested in, it can be a really good way of virtually getting to know people and having people recognize you. And then it can also make it easier when we do get back to face-to-face events to be able to talk to people in that way.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful advice. And yeah, it's very important to social network. Pauline.
For the early career researchers here, I think it's also important to develop your expertise as much as you can. but also diversify a little bit to see what other tools you can develop, because the tools are the things where you'll be able to apply them more broadly across sort of a transdisciplinary landscape. So, you know, the expertise is really valuable because that's what you're going to bring to every project you're part of, but also a diversification, you know, into tools which can be applicable to many questions. If I was back again as an early career researcher, that's what I would be doing.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Does anyone else have any, either presenters, any comments, or anybody else, any comments or questions before we maybe move to the breakout rooms? Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank the presenters, because your advice has been really helpful. Sorry, I just realized I was on mute. I'll close off, we'll just close off the session with a really quick presentation on some potential funding schemes. Can everyone see that I'm actually in presentation mode? Yep, great, thanks Shelley. So I'm not the expert, but I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, and if you'd like any further information, you can contact CUHK-USYD from the Office of Global Engagement for the Sydney participants. So as Shelley and I think we chatted about it. So we know that Pauline's project was funded through our Partnership Collaboration Awards. So I just wanted to obviously mention that again, because both institutions, Sydney and CUHK, co-fund co-fund to seed projects to really try to encourage collaborative projects between our institutions, because Chinese University of Hong Kong is one of our priority partners. So we have been able to fund 10 projects across medicine and health and science and social sciences and engineering. Unfortunately, because of due to COVID, we've had to suspend that funding, and we hope that we'll be able to resume it next year, pending borders open. This is a really, really helpful scheme where we encourage teams of researchers. And as Pauline alluded to before, it's really important to bring your early mid-career researchers up with you. And we do encourage that through these schemes that we do encourage early mid-career researchers and students on these schemes. So we're really trying to move away from that CI to CI model. The other scheme that is quite new that the University of Sydney is introducing, and this is just for Sydney early career researchers, but I thought it would be really helpful to mention this because we're quite excited about this scheme. And this is kind of in lieu of the fact that we're unable to provide the seed funding because travel is going to be an issue. So the aim of this scheme is to provide grants of up to $25,000 for teaching and administrative relief for our early mid-career researchers. And the idea is that the purpose of this is really to get our early mid-career researchers to engage with one of our priority partners and really develop some strong links which will lead to some leverage funding. So this will also include some training. So we will provide training on networking and grant writing and all sorts of really helpful information for our early mid-career researchers. And we're hoping that we're going to be piloting this project this year, and we're hoping to open it within the next 3 to 4 weeks. But this is kind of This is exciting for us because it's really aimed squarely at our early mid-career researchers. Sorry, I'm trying to get my cat out of the screen. The other scheme that I wanted to mention is an external funding scheme offered through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from the Australian government. This is around climate change. Obviously, the aim of it is there's individual grants between 20 and 50,000, and the applications at least meet one of the program criteria. And as you can see, sorry, see from what's highlighted in orange, we feel that this would be a great opportunity to strengthen bilateral relations with key partners in the Indo-Pacific, and we've checked that Hong Kong is definitely eligible for this scheme. So if you have any questions about this particular scheme, please reach out to CUHK-USYD. This would be a wonderful scheme that we could promote to encourage more collaborative projects between our institutions. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention, and I'll mention it because there's another DFAT scheme, is that these aren't really pure research schemes. It's around sort of developing collaborations which will improve, issues around, that are issues that need to be addressed, say, between, you know, Hong Kong and Australia. And so just be mindful of that. It's not a pure research scheme. So the DFAT National Foundation for Australia-China Relations is also a scheme that we actually opened up around this year, but they've promised, DFAT have promised that they're going to open up a second round this year, which is exciting. And as you can see from the objectives, it's really about promoting connections and practical cooperation. It's not pure research, showcasing our excellence and building understanding and exchange. As you can see, the priority areas are environment, climate change and health, which are really applicable to this group. And anything around addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. Hopefully it'll open the second half of the year and we'll widely promote this anyway. And just to sort of finish off, I'm going to use this opportunity to have a bit of a plug and to promote another session that we're this month. It's Opportunities in Hong Kong, Funding, Commercialisation and Government Support. Now, this is going to include representatives from the Hong Kong Trade Development Council and Innovation and Technology Commission. And they're going to talk about, you know, the research and development ecosystem in Hong Kong, priority areas of Hong Kong, and initiatives around funding schemes and support from the Hong Kong government. So this is going to be a fantastic event, and we really encourage you to attend this. And we will also widely promote this, but please let your colleagues know if you're interested in learning a bit more. And just to finish off, just to let you know, there is a lot of support from the Office of Global Engagement. We can assist our researchers to develop links and network with our CUHK counterparts. We can coordinate and help provide support for joint workshops and roundtables, to facilitate engagement and collaborations. And we can also help with some of those DFAT grants by providing a strategic review and application assistance for all those schemes that I mentioned in the PowerPoint. So please contact my colleague, Xiaohui. She is extremely knowledgeable and she can definitely provide that help. So I think that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand over to Shelley. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll be quick with my part. So in Hong Kong, I have we have two kinds of funding. We have the Hong Kong government funding. Those that are most relevant for this area of research is the Hong Kong Government Environment and Conservation Fund. That funds research projects in a number of areas for environmental research, technology demonstration, as well as for conferences. Year on year, they will change the theme. For this year is clean air and green transport. For projects, they can be awarded up to 2.5 million Hong Kong dollars. The exchange rate right now, if you're interested, is about 6 Hong Kong dollars to 1 Australian dollars. And if it's for a conference grant, is $500,000 Hong Kong dollars. This one is, the deadline is actually is passed internally. So, but I think it's something that we can keep on the radar for the next year. Another one also, the deadline has passed, but again, to keep on the radar, is for policy innovation and coordination. There's a strategic public policy research funding, both in the strategic area and in the non-strategic areas. This one, I mentioned before, they actually have the first one, the strategic area, that one, the timeline is just around the corner. But for the non-strategic areas, which covers 8 themes, that they accept applications all year round. So I encourage everybody to have a look at the non-strategic area to see if there's something that they can tap into within the next 12 months. And then for those of us who are based in Hong Kong, we're very familiar with the Research Grants Council funding, both the General Research Fund as well as Collaborative Research Fund, which is very relevant for today's discussion. And applications are due internally at CUHK in October. So we can start to actually look into those and see how we can use those funding to extend our collaboration or establish new ones. Amanda talked about the University of Sydney CUHK Partnership Collaboration Awards, so I won't go through that. But the Office of Academic Links at CUHK, we run the Internationalization Faculty Mobility Scheme. So we fund people to go out to visit as well as to bring people into CUHK. And then we also have a scheme to assist early careers, postdoc research fellows to visit their partners or to attend seminars, to meet up with people. And then we also have a Research Summit Series program where we fund organizations of workshops and meetings, primarily with two focus, to bring in our researchers as well as to open up opportunities for early careers. And then some shameless promotion about Hong Kong. We are home to some of the best universities in the world. So the Hong Kong government has funding to bring in talent. So we have the Hong Kong Research Grants Council Postdoctoral Fellowship Scheme. And CUHK right now is calling applications for the Vice Chancellor Early Career Professorship Scheme. So I put the links down there. Application is due later in the year. So that's all I have. So for any inquiries, please come and feel free to contact us. We can try to help you. And if not, we can always connect you with other people from within our organizations. So that's all I have for now. Amanda, do you have anything else to add?
Not really. Just wanted to thank all our presenters again today for taking the time out. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, with that, we will end our session today and we'll see everybody again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.